Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to hear all your expertise. I'm going to start with telling our audience a little bit about you. In addition to being a Naval Academy graduate, former Navy Surface Warfare officer, and a parent of 2 ROTC graduates, Lisa served as a Naval Academy Admissions Liaison, Blue and Gold officer, for 17 years in 3 different states. As a BGO, she presented Academy info sessions, advised candidates, and conducted candidate interviews. As the owner of Admissions Decrypted, she continues to advise students interested in military college programs and is very familiar with where students tend to encounter stumbling blocks. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today.
I am so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with defining what military college programs are.
Absolutely. That is a great question because students often think they know and they're only getting a little piece of that big elephant. So military college programs are programs that have the purpose of educating and training future officers for the U.S. military. So I categorize these as both the 5 federal service academies and all of the ROTC programs that are at civilian colleges across the U.S. It's important to recognize that students that are in these programs are both getting a college degree and getting military training that they'll use as junior officers when they get their commission.
So there is a military commitment to ROTC and the academies?
Yes, there is a military commitment for these programs. It's called a service obligation, and it depends on which program the student's in, and also depends on what service community they go into after commissioning. But it runs between 4 and 10 years. Typically, pilots and other aviators have a longer service commitment, and that relates to the longer training pipeline that they have after commissioning.
What would be the difference between an ROTC program and a military academy?
Great question. So a military academy, so let's start by naming them. There's 3 that are run by the Department of Defense: West Point, the Naval Academy, and the U.S. Air Force Academy. Those are really well known because they have great football teams and they've been around a long time. There's also 2 that are still federal academies but are not run by Department of Defense. Those are the Coast Guard Academy and the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. Those are not as well known because they're smaller. They have Division III sports, and they're not part of that big Department of Defense program. A military academy, students that are there, they're cadets, they're midshipmen, round the clock. So they wear uniforms to classes every single day. They do formations. They do military training over the summer. They live in a military hierarchy where they are organized into squads and companies and then larger elements. They have leadership positions within that military hierarchy. And at the same time, they're earning a college degree on their own campus. So their courses are taught by a mix of military officers and civilian professors, and they're getting a Bachelor of Science degree. And it's a degree that's accredited just like any other Bachelor of Science degree would be. A student that's in ROTC, they're not in the military 24/7, the way that an academy cadet or midshipman would be. They're attending a civilian university or college, and their academics include military, air, or naval science classes and military training with their ROTC unit. That ROTC unit is either embedded in their own college, or they might travel to a nearby college through a crosstown agreement and do their military training at that other campus.
And it's under my understanding that not every ROTC has all of the different branch options. Is that correct?
So not every college has an ROTC unit for every service. I think that's what you're asking about. So a good example, I live not far from George Mason University. George Mason has an Army ROTC unit. They're on campus. They have a crosstown agreement for Air Force ROTC with University of Maryland. So the students at George Mason drive to University of Maryland for their air science classes and their Air Force training. and they don't have anything for students interested in the Navy or Marine Corps. So if you wanted to commission in the Navy or Marine Corps, if you had a Navy ROTC scholarship, you'd need to be attending some different college. George Mason wouldn't be an option for you.
Because we talk about college admissions, right? And the military academies, I know, have a very different admissions process. And the timeline's a little bit different than a usual college admissions timeline, where you could start senior year and, you know, work around, or you could start earlier. What does the admissions process look like, for example, with the academies?
Okay, so that's a great question. And it is earlier. We talk sometimes to students about early decision and early action deadlines and how early those are. You have to be ready by November 1st. Well, November 1st for a military program, you've already missed several critical deadlines. So for the service academies, I might suggest that a student start all the way back in winter of junior year by applying to their summer leadership programs for rising seniors. So they have different names. AIM is the Coast Guard program, Summer Seminar, Summer Leadership Experience is what West Point calls it. And those are a competitive application that opens sometime between November and April, depending on the program. And then they run in the summer, usually June, before senior year. It's not a requirement to apply to that program. It's not a requirement to attend that program, but it's an immersive orientation and introduction to what attending an academy would be like. It also serves as a preliminary application. If a student doesn't apply to that summer program, then the preliminary applications are usually open in April of junior year. The student wants to apply to that preliminary application, they'll be designated as a candidate, and then they'll get another invitation to the portal for the application, the full application, and it's going to have elements that are very similar to what you'd see in the Common App. What are your activities? Answer some essay questions for us. Give us letters of recommendation, contacts, give us a contact for your counselor so that we can get your transcript. Those things are going to be very similar. But for the service academies, a student also has to have a nomination. The nomination is a completely separate application process. Every US citizen student is eligible to request a nomination from their members of Congress, so their representative and both of their senators. They can also request one from the vice president. And then for the Department of Defense academies, West Point or the Military Academy, the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, there's also service-connected nominations for students who either have their own military service, they're enlisted, they're in junior ROTC or ROTC programs, or their parent was a career member of the military. And those deadlines can be very early. I have a student who submitted for a September 9th nomination deadline. So what that means is if you're coming to this process senior year around September, October, you may have a diminishing window of nominations that are available to you, and you might need to really hop to it. But I also want to say that a student shouldn't feel like they've had to be thinking about academies since they were 8, because that's not the case. A student who's taken rigorous classes and gotten good grades in them, a student who has pretty good test scores, who's been involved in athletics, who has taken on leadership responsibilities, those are the sorts of things that an academy or a ROTC scholarship review is going to be looking for. And that isn't something that a student is going to be able to just tack on senior year, but also it's something that many competitive students have been doing all along.
And then once they secure the nomination and they turn in their application, is there anything after that? Because I've possibly heard that even the nomination might not be a guarantee.
Oh, a nomination is 100% not a guarantee. There are probably 10 nominations for every student that will actually be offered an appointment, rough numbers. So a nomination is a requirement. It's in the necessary but not sufficient category. So students shouldn't think, ooh, I got a nomination, I'm done. It's not done. And there's students who may have several nominations from multiple sources, and it's not done. One thing that they in particular need to keep working through is the medical qualification process. State university isn't going to care about your medical qualification, but the military, because their purpose is to train and equip officers for the military, they care very much that you're medically qualified for that military service. And that process starts when your academy application is complete or nearly complete. And for ROTC, it doesn't start until you're selected for a scholarship. So it can take several months to work through that. It's very detailed. There are many reasons a student could be disqualified based on medical reasons.
Isn't there's a physical fitness component to this as well?
Right. There is a physical assessment, a fitness assessment. The Department of Defense academies use the same candidate fitness assessment across all three. Coast Guard, Merchant Marine are different, and then each of the ROTC programs have their own different and individual fitness assessment, which means you might be taking several if you're applying to several different programs.
What does the application process look like for an ROTC student? How is that different?
Yeah, so first off, I want to say that you don't have to be a scholarship student to be part of ROTC in college. And I think that's really important because students will often apply to the 4-year scholarships with senior year of high school, not get it, and then think, oh, well, game over. And it's not game over. There's lots of students who enroll in the ROTC program that's at their college. They participate, they take the classes, they do the training on the weekends, and they get offered a 3-year scholarship, or they get offered a 2-year scholarship, or they are given advanced standing status and still end up on that pathway to a commission. So if the student's interest is in becoming an Air Force officer, a Marine Corps officer, a Navy officer, they should definitely do that even if they aren't getting the tuition support. But the scholarship application process for a high school student, that application opens up again between spring of junior year and around July before senior year. And there's multiple boards, review boards for the scholarships. I like students to be prepared to apply by the beginning of October so they can hit the earliest review board. But there's a few reasons why a student might want to hold back and wait until a board that's after the holidays if they are still working on their fitness, particularly students who need to get their run times down or their pull-up counts up. Maybe they want an extra month or two to work on that. If they're working on their SAT or ACT scores, because these military college programs really value those scores as part of the selection process. We can argue about whether they should or not, but the fact is they do. So students should prep for them and come in with the best scores they can achieve at that point in time. And then the last reason that a student might want to delay completing their application is if they've had some stumbling as they went along through high school, but they're on an upward trend and they want first semester senior year grades to be considered. I think that's especially important for students applying to the Air Force or applying to the Navy where they have preferred majors and they're looking really closely at math and science classes, particularly physics. Maybe they want to get that first semester grade in and show, hey, I took calculus and I got an A. I have what it takes to succeed in your program. And the easiest way to delay to that subsequent board is to just hold off on doing the officer interview until after the October board happens.
Let's talk a little bit about the scholarship itself, because a lot of students, this is new to them. The idea of it is they hear that, they could go to the academy and everything's paid for, but they're maybe not as familiar with the ROTC scholarship. How much does that involve and for how long?
Okay, so it depends. This isn't an answer for everything in college admissions, right?
Right. Everything in college admissions. Well, it depends on the student situation and the school.
So for ROTC scholarship, it depends on the service. The Navy pays for full tuition. The Air Force has multiple types of scholarships, and right now they're only awarding type 1 to students who are in high school, but they have also a type 2 and a type 7, and those are smaller award amounts that might only pay for in-state tuition, or it might pay a fixed amount at a private college. The Army pays for full tuition, but they award the largest number of scholarships are 3-year scholarships, and then they'll go back and they'll award 4-year scholarships to the highest qualified students on their slate that year. And again, you can apply for a scholarship by being a college student and participating with the unit, and then your staff can put you in for a college-based scholarship. So there's a couple ways of doing that. But the biggest difference is that the ROTC scholarships in and of themselves don't pay for room and board. They're paying for tuition. Okay, now put an asterisk on what I just said. I'll come back to that in a minute, because again, it depends. There are some colleges where the college itself will provide an institutional scholarship of some type for students that are either participating in ROTC or are on an ROTC scholarship. So one example of that would be University of Kentucky. They have a scholarship that pays for part of room and board for students that are on ROTC scholarship. There was one I learned about just this morning that's University of Oklahoma. And by state law, students who are participating in ROTC at a college in Oklahoma are entitled to only be charged in-state tuition. So that's a discount that comes from the institution itself. The asterisk I said about pays for tuition, not room and board, there are some circumstances in which it will pay for one or the other. So a student who is in Army ROTC can choose to have their scholarship applied to room and board instead of to tuition. And starting this year, Navy also has that same option. So the student that benefits is a student who maybe they're a really high achieving student and they got a founder's scholarship at their college that's going to pay for tuition, but it's tuition restricted. Well, now that ROTC scholarship can come in and pay for food and housing instead. Alternately, maybe they're at a state school where the in-state tuition is lower cost than the cost of housing would be. So again, it depends.
Like
and the best
California,
resource,
right?
like in California, like in North Carolina, and the best resource for these dollar amounts is one, look at the website for the individual ROTC scholarship. So that's going to be the Navy scholarship, the Air Force ROTC scholarship, the Army ROTC scholarship, or contact the unit at colleges where you're interested in attending. Don't be scared off by these officers that are staffs at the units. They really want to talk to students. They want to explain what their program is like and the benefits of being in that program. And I've found that they're incredibly responsive.
Let's talk a little bit about, first and foremost, how would a student maybe go about, starting freshman or sophomore year? What would be the suggestions? And I know that we always have to tread carefully because we have a lot of students who are like, well, what is it going to take for me to get in there, right? How do I maximize my chances of getting in? But at the same time, everybody's different. So it really depends on the student and everything else. But what does maybe an academy student look like? What are the best chances for maximizing being a good candidate?
Sure. And let me reinforce that idea that students are going to look different. We talk in college admissions often about holistic evaluation, and the military programs, they really are doing that. They are looking for a whole person evaluation, and they'll score and give a student a whole person score so they can compare the student who is taking one set of classes and doing football in California with a student that has a different set of classes available to them and is a cheerleader in New Jersey. How do you do those apples to apples? They have a numerical solution for it. So things that I would recommend a student do starting freshman year: one, take challenging academic classes and get strong grades in them. That, like other college applications, that remains a primary sorting hat mechanism. They really want to see students who are challenging themselves academically and doing well. Navy, Air Force, and Space Force all have preferred majors, and as those are STEM majors and in some cases critical language majors, and they're going to look very hard at math and science classes, particularly chemistry and physics. Then the student needs to be finding places they can develop as a leader. Leadership isn't having a fancy title. It doesn't have to be being the student body treasurer or being the head of a club or being elected team captain. Typically, the people who have those fancy title positions, that's in recognition of the fact that they've assumed responsibility and taken initiative often throughout their high school years. So that's what I recommend students do, is they find places where they care about what's going on and they care enough to step up, initiate something to fix a problem, to improve a situation, to bring other people in. That's what leadership is about. Responsibility goes hand in hand with leadership. So that means that if you're working, if you have family obligations, caring for younger siblings, caring for an extended member of your family, maybe you live on a farm and helping to take care of the farm, or you work in a family business, that is a responsibility as well. And that tends to get measured in the same pot as leadership. The next thing is athletics and fitness. So I always get asked, do you have to be on a sport? You don't have to be on a team sport. You don't have to be in a sport. But what does a sport do? Well, a sport helps you develop physically. And we've talked about how fitness assessments are an inherent part of this application process. But it also gives you a place to develop as a team member, as a leader, as a follower. These are all important things. If you are not in a sport in high school, whether that's a team sport, a sport that's run by your high school, a sport that's not, club swimming, martial arts, you need to be active. And I mean, you need to be active, not a workout once in a while, but a daily routine or a really frequent routine. And you need to be practicing that fitness assessment and the other aspects of physical conditioning that you'll be expected to do as a cadet or midshipman. So there's some people who are really great fitness advisors who are not me. Look to them. Stu Smith is one. He's a Naval Academy classmate of mine. He does a lot with developing people towards military programs physically, and he's got a lot on his blog that I think is good. But there's YouTube videos for how to do the basketball throw, how to do the shuttle run. There's stuff from Army Cadet Command about how to do the Army Combat Fitness Test. Look at those things, understand what you're going to be tasked to do, and start developing towards it. And then the last thing, and maybe this should have been the first thing, think about why you want to be in the military and be able to articulate that. So sometimes when I'm doing practice interviews with a student, or when I was a blue and gold officer and I was asking students at information events, why do you want to be in the Navy? Why do you want to be in the military? I got a lot of stunned silence. And then I had mom or dad start to answer the question. We're talking about 10 or 15 years of your life when you count the time in the college program and the obligated service afterward. Don't you think that's something you ought to consider the why behind and spend a little bit of your energy investigating? What does the Army do that you're excited about? What does Space Force do that you want to be a part of? I really like reading. I learned by reading. I have a book list on the Admissions Decrypted website because I think that reading allows you to see the leadership experiences of people who aren't like you. So I would recommend you read memoirs of people who were junior officers. They don't all have to be exactly like you. Male students can read Breaking Ice, Breaking Glass, which is a book by a Coast Guard leader who's a woman. and has an enormous amount of experience. You can read articles about African American fighter pilots and what their experience was. And there will be a lot of relevance to you, even if you are not identical to them.
That's great. I believe on your website you say leaders are readers, and I agree
Leaders
with
are
that.
readers. I didn't invent that. There's a lot of generals and admirals who have used that tagline over the years, but I do think it's really true. Like I said, I do learn by reading. I think books let you experience other people's mistakes and learn from them without having to do them yourself, because your bucket of mistakes is going to be pretty big on its own. Maybe you could cut down by 10% by reading what some other people encountered in their military experience and the regrets that they have and what they wish they would have done differently.
Can I ask, because you mentioned the interview and you mentioned helping students with interviews. Could we peel back that layer a little bit? What should a student maybe expect in one of these interviews? Other than why do you want to be in the military?
Mm-hmm. So the interviews are going to ask a lot about your leadership experience. They're going to want to know, they are going to want to know why you want to join. They're probing for a couple things in particular. Have you exerted yourself enough to know what you're embarking on? Are you interested in the program because either you think it's high prestige or you just are looking for the money? You're looking for a way to pay for college and you haven't really considered what the trade-off is. Sometimes I've heard people say that service academies aren't free, you just don't pay in cash. I think that's important. There is a service obligation and you give up a lot of your independent action while you're a student, while you're in the military. Other things that they'll ask about are, tell me about a time you were in charge of things. What did that look like? What did you learn through the process? Tell me about a time you were in charge and it didn't go well. What did you learn from that? When I do interviews, I spend a lot of time talking to people about their mistakes and their failures because I want to know that they can reflect on that, that they can identify that they will not always have it together, because they will not always have it together. That's just a truism of life, and it's a truism in the military as well. I'm going to ask about how they organize their day or their week, how they study for tests, how they decision make when they have time management conflicts. If it's the weekend of the big sporting event and also Monday is a big academic test, how do you prep for that? How do you decision make? Sometimes you might ask about a military leader that someone has respect for, but that's more common, I think, as an essay prompt. The interview as a whole tends to be between 30 minutes and maybe even as long as 90 minutes, depending on the program. It's also an opportunity for the student to ask questions. And I would encourage them to come with some questions that are not easily searchable on the internet. A good one to ask is, well, why did you join the military? What have you really enjoyed doing in the military? If you could go back and do it again, would you do something different? You know, would you take on a different branch of the military? Would you try to go a different route as a career specialty? I think those are questions that get your interviewer talking about their own experience, and it can give a student a good window in what this other human being's experience in the military has been like. Would I want to follow in a similar path?
It's similar to asking questions of admissions officers or students when you go visit, what would you change? What would you do differently to just get a better feel for that experience at that school?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you were doing an ROTC interview where there's multiple colleges that have students in that unit, I'd ask about that. In particular, if some colleges are on a semester program and some do quarters, what does that look like? How do you travel from one university to the other? do leadership positions tend to go to students at the host unit, at the host college, or is it more broadly distributed? Another question that you might ask is, does your unit have any input into the admissions decision? And that answer, again, varies a whole bunch from no, not really any at all, to yes, students who have scholarships are very likely to be admitted, to somewhere in between. I had a unit a couple weeks ago say that admissions at their college would give a student a hard second look, but having a scholarship would not qualify the unqualified. And then one other distinction I would make about the interviews for these programs versus other typical college interviews. Sometimes as consultants, we talk about interviews that are evaluative or informative. So some interviews, the mission of that interview is really to sell the student on attending that college, or to help keep alumni engaged with the university for alumni relations purposes. And it's unquestionable that interview for a military college program, whether it's an ROTC scholarship or an academy program, those are 100% an evaluative interview process. So students need to come in from the very beginning of the interview and recognize that nothing is a coincidence and everything is a test. From the moment they walk into the room, they're being measured.
I do have one more question about interviews. For military specifically, would it be bad for a student to perhaps tell them that they do have a backup plan in case they don't get into this particular program, that they were thinking about, maybe joining ROTC if they were applying for a military academy, or maybe they had a backup branch that they were thinking about? Would that be a bad decision or a good decision?
I think that's perfectly fine to talk about for students who are applying to an academy. I always liked to hear that they had also investigated the related ROTC program. For students who are in an ROTC program and they're asked, well, what are you going to do if you don't get a scholarship? I think to say, I'm really interested in being a Space Force officer, and this is the route I have in mind. Does that make sense? Does that seem like a good plan to you, sir, ma'am? Can you tell me more about how many cadets in your unit get advanced standing if they enroll without a scholarship? That's a great conversation to have. What I would caution a student against is making any program feel like they are the backup choice. So project your excitement about the program you're interviewing with at that moment.
Nobody wants to be second.
Nobody wants to be second. Yeah, and that's colleges too, civilian colleges.
So I tell students, it's like asking someone to prom. Nobody wants to be the ninth person that you've asked to prom, or even the second. You want to be first choice.
But
Always.
it is totally reasonable to say, I'm really interested in being in military aviation. And because of that, I am applying to the Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy. I'm also applying to the Coast Guard Academy and Merchant Marine Academy because they have aviation pathways. And I'm looking at Air Force ROTC and Navy ROTC because they have aviation pathways.
I have another big question for you, especially as a woman in the military. As a civilian, I've heard a lot of stories. I've heard a lot of things in the news. What advice would you have for young women going into the academy or ROTC programs?
Yeah, that's a big elephant in the room. And I think the summary is we've come a really long ways and we have a long ways to go. So women in the academies and the officer corps for the militaries range between 20 and 30%. That's a huge jump from the 7 to 10% it was when I was a midshipman. The Coast Guard has the first female service chief. There have been multiple vice chief of naval operations who have been women. And let's broaden it to not just women, but minorities. The chief of staff of the Air Force is African American, as is the senior enlisted member in the Air Force, which they're a power duo. 30 to 40% of the officer corps and academy midshipmen and cadets are minority of one type or another. But it's also real that sexual assault and sexual harassment is still a problem in the military, and racism is still a problem in the military. The reason there's still problems in the military is there are problems in American society. And is it worse in the military or not? I think it can be really rough in the military because they're a hierarchy. So when sexual harassment or racism is coming down that chain of command, I think it can feel much worse than when it's just a random person on your college campus that's doing it. At the same time, I feel like the military recognizes that it's a problem and is actively taking steps to deal with it in ways that many civilian universities turn a blind eye to. I would hold up the way that the military's expectations and reactions to harassment and assault against, say, the average stuff that happens on a weekend on Fraternity Row or down a street filled with student housing. I actually think that the military probably comes out ahead. I felt very safe on my military academy campus. There were no blue lights. I felt fine running across campus. I think like a lot of campuses, it is more the people you are close to that are probably going to be the people that you have adverse encounters with.
Are there still positions that women are barred from in the military?
Ooh, that's a little bit of a stump the chump question. I do not think there are any where women are barred by statute. There are some that women have not yet done. My go-to answer for that would be SEALs. There are women who have been eligible to go to SEAL training. You must be a volunteer to do that, even though there is a service assignment process, and there to date has not been a woman who has gone. Another one that was closed off for a long time by statute was submarines. And we're over 10 years now that women have been on submarines and qualified as submarine officers and submarine enlisted. So that's a really big deal.
Is there anything else that you would like students to know who are considering the academies or ROTC?
I would recommend that they spend a lot of time thinking about what they might do in the military. I know I've said that before, but you wouldn't go down a pre-med pathway without ever having thought about what it would be like to be in medicine. And I think you wouldn't go down like pre-law or go into an undergraduate business program without thinking about what would you like to do with that. So I would recommend that students take the opportunities that present themselves to talk to people who are currently in the military. If you're talking to veterans, recognize that the military of 40 years ago is different. In many ways, it's the same, but in many ways, it's very different. Even my own experience is very different from what people currently serving are experiencing. So every opportunity you have to talk to someone who's currently in is really great. There's great podcasts for women. I like the Service Academy Sorority podcast, which interviews women who went to all 5 of the federal service academies over the whole expanse of time over the last 40 years. Very recent graduates and graduates from the original classes. The Naval Academy Minority Association has done some really nice webinars that are available on YouTube. I like stuff by General Ty Seidel from West Point. especially on the topics of diversity in the military and in the Army in particular. But just take every opportunity you can. Go to an air show, go to a visit ship when those present themselves. If there is a midshipman or a cadet doing an operation information event at your high school, go and talk to them. If there's an information day that is put on by a member of Congress in your area, go and talk to those reps. Hear about their programs, ask them questions, ask them hard questions. What are the chances I'm going to be a pilot? What if I really want to become a SEAL? What's that process look like? Ask a lot of questions, do a lot of reading, do a lot of listening, and practice your pull-ups.
Practice your pull-ups. I love it.
Back to the pull-ups.
Back to the pull-ups. Lisa, thank you so much for giving us all of your wisdom. Again, you can be contacted through admissionsdecrypted.com, right?
Yes.
And you have amazing blog posts.
Thank you so much.
Great services, and we'll have that link definitely on the website so you can check it out.
Thank you so much.